Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm diving into tomorrow's mass readings for Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. We have some absolutely fascinating text to explore today. We're moving from the oppression narrative into the resistance story. Then we're getting hit with some of Jesus' harshest words about missed opportunities. So settle in, grab a coffee, and let's geek out over some ancient texts together. Today we're exploring themes of providence, protection, and the consequences of spiritual blindness. Our first reading takes us to one of the most beautifully crafted narratives in Hebrew literature, the birth and life of early Moses. But there's so much more going on here than meets the eyes. This passage is structured as what scholars would call a birth legend. It's very similar to stories about Sargon of Akkad, Cyprus the Great, or Romulus and Remus. There's a specific pattern: a threatened royal child, a miraculous rescue, adoption by royalty, and then an eventual return to fulfill their destiny. Here's where it gets interesting. The Hebrew text is full of wordplay that gets lost in translation. Moses' name, Moshe, connects to the verb to draw out, which is mashah. It's Egyptian, not Hebrew. So Pharaoh's daughter essentially says, I'll call him by an Egyptian name that sounds like what happened. Kind of interesting, right? She's naming the future liberator using an Egyptian word. The detail about the papyrus basket, tevat gomeh, uses the same Hebrew word teva that's used for Noah's Ark. This isn't a coincidence. Both stories are about divine preservation via water. The biblical authors are drawing a very deliberate parallel. Now, check this out. Moses kills the Egyptian overseer and buries him in the sand. The Hebrew word for sand, chol, is the same word used about God's promise to Abraham about the descendants as numerous as the sand. Moses literally buries Egypt's oppression in Israel's future. So here's an archaeological note. The store cities of Pithom and Ramses mentioned in the context were real places. Actually, recently they were excavated. There's a city, likely ancient Pithom. It was rapidly built during the 13th century BCE. Pretty interesting. Psalm 69 is what scholars call a lament of the individual. It's way more complex than that. Save me, O God, for the waters have reached my neck. This isn't metaphorical drowning, it's actually cosmic chaos imagery. The Hebrew word for deep waters, mayim rabim, literally means many waters. It's the same phrase that's used in creation narratives to describe primordial chaos. The psalmist isn't just in trouble, they're actually experiencing uncreation, which is a return to primordial chaos. But notice the movement from sinking in the miry depths with his bivien mitzvah to praise and thanksgiving. The word for miry depths uses a root that means to be deep or kind of shadowy, and it isn't a place where light can reach. So, here's a fascinating connection. The psalm is heavily quoted in the New Testament in reference to Jesus' passion. The early Christian community saw Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of this righteous suffering. Now, on to this week's Gospel. Matthew chapter 11, verses 20 through 24, which could be the harshest words in all the Gospels. Now, we get to some of Jesus' most challenging words. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Interesting historical context here. Chorazin and Bethsaida were prosperous fishing towns on the Sea of Galilee. Archaeological evidence actually shows that they were thriving commercial centers. They certainly weren't backwater villages. They were economically successful, and they were religiously observant Jewish communities. Jesus uses a very specific form of prophetic judgment speech in this gospel called a woe oracle. This follows the pattern of Hebrew prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah. The structure is you announce judgment, you state an offense, and then you compare that to demonstrate the severity of the offense. Then a declaration of consequences. So a good comparison is actually Tyre or Sidon. It's pretty brilliant rhetoric, right? Tyre and Sidon were Phoenician cities. They were traditionally enemies of Israel. They were associated with idolatry and moral corruption. Jesus is essentially saying even pagans would have responded better than you did. The phrase mighty works in this gospel, which is dynamis, doesn't just mean miracles. In Greek, dynamis refers to acts of power that reveal divine authority. Jesus isn't just talking about healing the sick. He's actually talking about divine self-revelation being rejected. The comparison with Sodom is very striking here. In Jewish theology, Sodom represented the ultimate in wickedness and divine judgment. Jesus is saying that rejecting the kingdom of God is worse than the immorality and inhospitality that destroyed Sodom. I briefly want to touch on the Day of Judgment language and how that plays out in this gospel reading too. It will be more tolerable on the Day of Judgment. So this phrase, which is hemera krisios, it refers to the final divine assize, the ultimate accountability moment. Here's what's really fascinating, though. Jesus isn't talking about damnation or salvation. He's actually talking about degrees of specific accountability. The Greek construction suggests that there's a comparative judgment. Those who had greater revelation bear greater responsibility. It really isn't about eternal torture. It's more about cosmic justice that takes into account what happened, what people knew, and what people experienced. Early Christian theologians like Origen and John Chrysostom interpreted this referring to the principle that to whom much is given, much is required. The intensity of judgment corresponds to the intensity of revelation that you received. So, here's what binds today's readings together. Divine providence creates human responsibility. Moses is preserved by God's providence, but that preservation comes with a mission. He has to become the liberator. The psalmist experienced divine rescue, but they respond with praise and thanksgiving. The cities that Jesus addresses received unprecedented revelation, but failed to respond appropriately. Here's a historical parallel. This pattern appears throughout Jewish and Christian history. Communities that receive great spiritual gifts often face the greatest temptation towards complacency. Think about the medieval monasteries that became wealthy landowners, or Renaissance papal courts, or modern churches. Here's a little archaeological sidebar for you. So we're going to go to 1st century Galilee. Recent excavations at Chorazin have uncovered a magnificent synagogue. We believe that it's from the 3rd or 4th century CE. It was built on earlier foundations. The prosperity that's really evident in this archaeological record confirms this was not a poor, desperate community. They had resources, education, and religious infrastructure. Their failure to respond was not due to ignorance or poverty. So in conclusion, what do we take from today's readings? They challenge our assumptions about divine favoritism. God's providence isn't about being shielded from responsibility. It's about being equipped for greater responsibility. Moses' rescue as a baby wasn't so that he could live a comfortable life in Pharaoh's palace. It was so that he could become the liberator. The psalmist's rescue from the deep waters wasn't just personal salvation. It became the basis for public testimony and praise. And Jesus' harsh words to these Galilean cities reminds us that revelation creates accountability. The more clearly we see divine truth, the more we're responsible for responding to it. The question that these texts leave us with is, what have we been given and what are we doing with it? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into tomorrow's readings. These are challenging texts that don't really offer easy comfort, but what they do offer is profound insight into how divine grace and human responsibility intersect. What struck you the most about today's analysis? Drop a comment below. I especially love hearing different perspectives on these complex passages. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next week, we're looking at more Exodus narratives. And I promise you, the Burning Bush episode has some linguistic surprises that might blow your mind. Until then, keep reading, keep questioning, and remember, every text has layers waiting to be discovered. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.